Picture this, a quiet Amish farmhouse deep in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The lanterns are out, the horses are settled in the barn, it's well past midnight, and inside that farmhouse 2 teenagers are lying in the same bed under the same heavy quilt. And no, they are not married. Here's the part nobody believes. Their parents know exactly where they are. In fact, they allowed it. Now I know what you're thinking right now. Same bed, same quilt, same hormones. 2 young Amish kids full of all the same human desires as anyone else. How is that even possible? And no, this wasn't a secret. It wasn't some rebellious teenage stunt. It was expected. By the end of this story, you may never look at courtship the same way again. Let me introduce you to a young Amish man. I'm going to tell you the story of one Amish couple whose names I've changed for privacy. We'll call him Jacob. 18 years old, calloused hands from working his father's fields, a shy smile he can't quite control when he's nervous. And the girl, we'll call her Mary, 17, with eyes that seem to see right through a person, a laugh that makes Jacob forget every word of every hymn at the Sunday singings. For months now, Jacob has been noticing her, giving her rides home in his buggy, stealing glances when nobody's watching. Then one autumn evening, Mary's father gives Jacob the nod. That nod means everything in Amish country. It means you may come calling. So late that night, long after the kerosene lamps are out and the whole house has gone still, Jacob walks 3 miles down a dark gravel road, his boots crunching on the stones, his stomach tied in knots. Mary opens the door without a word. She leads him inside. And then she leads him to her bed. But here's where it gets even stranger. Before Jacob can even take off his boots, the floorboards creak behind him. Mary's father is standing in the doorway. He's not angry. He's not suspicious. He's holding something. A long, heavy wooden board. And without a word, he walks to the bed and places it right down the center, between where Jacob will lie and where Mary will lie, a physical wall of separation. Then he simply says goodnight and walks away. Think about that for a moment. A father knowingly allows his teenage daughter to spend the entire night in bed with a boy. But first he builds a barrier between them and trusts them both to honor it. That is either complete madness or it's one of the most profound acts of intentional trust you'll ever encounter. Now you might be wondering, does this actually work? Do 2 teenagers lying inches apart in the dark really keep their hands to themselves all night long? Keep wondering, because the answer isn't as simple as you think. Let me tell you what happens in that dark room. Jacob lies on his side of the board. Mary lies on hers. The house is so silent they can hear each other breathing. Outside, a horse snorts softly in the barn. The wind presses against the window. The quilt is heavy and smells faintly of lye soap and hay. And they talk. For hours. Whispering. Are you afraid of marriage? Mary asks into the darkness. Jacob is quiet for a long moment. Only if it's with the wrong person, he finally says. She smiles. He can't see it, but somehow he can feel it. Later, when the conversation drifts toward the future, Mary's voice changes. I don't know, she says quietly. Don't know what? Jacob asks. Whether I'd be a good wife? The silence that follows is not awkward. It's honest. They talk about childhood. About the time Jacob fell out of the hayloft and his father carried him 3 miles to the nearest English doctor. About Mary's mother's strawberry rhubarb pie and how Mary is terrified she'll never make it as good as her ma'am does. This is a tradition that historically some Amish and related plain communities have called bundling. And it didn't start with the Amish. It traveled from Switzerland and Germany hundreds of years ago, long before any Amish feet touched American soil. And back then, in the old country, in certain communities, it was even more intense. Some accounts describe the girl being sewn into something called a bundling bag, a heavy cloth sack she wore like a sleeping bag dress. Getting anywhere under that required serious effort and a whole lot of noise. These weren't suggestions. These were engineered barriers built on generations of hard-earned wisdom about human nature. Not every Amish community today practices bundling in exactly the same way, and some don't practice it at all anymore. But where it exists, the philosophy behind it reveals something profound. The Amish know exactly what temptations exist. They're not naive. They just believe in creating situations that test your discipline while also giving you every possible tool to maintain it. Now here's the part that'll really get you. Jacob once described those nights, years later, as the most intimate moments of his entire life. Not because anything physical happened, because nothing did, but because something much deeper happened. He learned Mary's soul before he ever learned her body. Try finding that on a dating app. But let's be honest. You're still wondering, aren't you? What about temptation? What about the nights when the wooden board wasn't enough? Here's the truth the Amish don't often say out loud but quietly understand. Sometimes lines get crossed. Sometimes the bundling board doesn't do its job. Sometimes a baby arrives a little sooner than 9 months after the wedding. These are human beings, not angels. But here's what shocked me most when I learned it. The community doesn't destroy the couple when that happens. There's no public shaming, no exile, no scarlet letter. What happens is quiet, a quicker wedding. Maybe a private ceremony instead of the big fall celebration. The baby is born into a family and a community that wraps around them like a quilt, and then everyone moves forward. There's an old Amish saying that gets whispered around in moments like this. The first baby can come anytime. The second one takes 9 months. That's not a joke, that's grace. And in a world where we cancel people for far less, there's something quietly staggering about that kind of forgiveness. But whether Jacob and Mary ever made it to the altar, that's a story we'll come back to, because first you need to understand what all those nights behind the board were actually building. Imagine spending month after month lying next to someone you're falling in love with, unable to even hold their hand. Every night a test, every dawn a victory. By the time an Amish couple finally marries, they've shared something most modern couples never experience. They've built a relationship on pure communication, on shared values, on tested restraint, on thousands of whispered words in the dark. So when Jacob and Mary finally stood before their community one cold November morning, when Mary wore the blue dress she'd sewn herself and Jacob couldn't stop grinning, they weren't two strangers nervously anticipating a wedding night. They were two souls who had already been intimate in every way except one. And that night, for the very first time, there was no wooden board between them. An Amish grandmother once told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "We learned to be still with each other before we learned anything else. And by the time we came together, it felt like coming home." I had to sit with that for a while. Imagine Jacob and Mary growing old together. More than 4 decades pass, 7 children, 22 grandchildren. A lifetime built not on a single wedding day, but on all those long, quiet nights with a wooden board between them. Learning that real intimacy has almost nothing to do with the body and almost everything to do with the soul. The board was never really there to keep them apart. It was there to teach them how to stay together. Some people call bundling outdated. Others call it one of the smartest courtship traditions ever created. Maybe the Amish never taught people how to fall in love. Maybe they taught them how to stay there.